Chapter 9. Clara. Clara watched Mason limp up the stairs and bit her lip. That hadn't gone the way she'd wanted it to at all. Perhaps she should have just told him the truth. But she knew the moment she did, his view of her would change forever, and she wasn't ready for that yet. Even worse, she'd upset him, causing him to aggravate his injury. Every bone in her body screamed that he shouldn't play on Sunday, but he wasn't going to listen to her. Did she tell Justin then? If she did, and Mason was benched, he might never forgive her. But if she didn't, and he got injured, could she forgive herself? "Lord, I need some advice," she whispered softly as she gathered up the dishes. Mason had made it clear he wanted her gone, but she wasn't about to leave him with a sink full of dirty dishes, especially when it had been her idea to cook for him. When the dishes were washed, she gathered her own supplies and packed them back in her carrying case. With a final glance up the silent stairs, she sighed and headed back to her car. As soon as she slid into the seat and the door closed behind her, she pulled out her phone. Surprised to see 3 missed calls, she swiped the screen, shaking her head when Joel's name popped up. Was the man so dense that he didn't realize her lack of communication was her breaking things off? Sure, it was a little cowardly, but it also saved her from having to deal with her father, which was the most important thing. Ignoring Joel's calls, she dialed Adrian instead, hoping she wasn't interrupting dinner or some other family time. "Hey girl, what's up?" Adrian's chipper voice said when the line stopped ringing. "I need advice." Clara laid out the night and the additional information about Mason's injury and waited. "Let me ask you a question," Adrian said after a long pause. "Do you still love him?" "What?" Clara hadn't mentioned anything about her feelings for Mason, nor had that been part of her question. Besides, what did it have to do with his treatment? "You heard me. Do you still love him?" Adrian said each word slowly, as if that might help Clara understand the question. "The way I see it is that is the most important question. If you love him and want a second chance with him, then tell him about your father. Explain to him why you broke up with him. Otherwise, it's always going to be a bone of contention between the two of you. If you don't love him, then it doesn't matter, and you're worrying about it for nothing. If this were any other player that you didn't have a history with, would you tell your head trainer?" Clara sighed. "Yeah, I probably would. Football players are stubborn, and whether Justin does anything about it or not, at least I'll have put my 2 cents in. But Mason isn't just some normal player." "Exactly, which is why you need to be honest with yourself and decide if you still love him." Clara knew Adrian was right, but sometimes she hated the fact that her friend could put the answer out so plainly and yet avoid the question entirely. She'd wanted advice from her friends, but instead all she had was an even bigger question to consider. "Thanks, A. I guess I've got some soul-searching to do." "I'm always here when you need some honesty," Adrian said with a laugh. "Oops, gotta run. Baby needs a bath. Tell me how it goes." The phone went dead in Clara's ear, and she placed it on the dashboard holder before backing out of Mason's driveway. Did she love him? That was a very good question. She cared about him, for sure, and she had loved him once, but that had been years ago. Yet, if she were honest with herself, part of why his injury bothered her so much was because she was worried about him. More worried than she would be about a normal player. The question still plagued her half an hour later as she pulled into the parking lot of her apartment complex, and she had a feeling it wouldn't get resolved anytime soon. Clara stood before Justin's desk the next morning with butterflies in her stomach. She had tossed and turned most of the night, and while she still wasn't sure of her feelings for Mason, she was sure that telling Justin of his injury was the right thing. Once he knew, the weight of guilt could be lifted from her shoulders, as the decision of whether Mason could play or not would be on Justin and not her. Clara, what can I do for you this morning? Justin smiled as he looked up at her. I wanted to talk to you about Mason Dixon, she said softly. Though she'd made up her mind, it didn't make the words any easier to say. Is there a problem? Justin stood and walked around his desk before leaning against it. Clara wanted to take a step back away from him, but she held her ground. Maybe. She swallowed hard, summoning the courage to continue. He hurt his ankle last Friday in practice, and the coach sent him to see me. I examined him, and I think it might be Achilles tendonitis, but he won't go in for an MRI. He's been icing it, but it's still bothering him, and I'm worried about him playing on Sunday. Justin folded his arms across his chest and regarded her. What does Mason say? That it's just a strain. He says he's putting it up at night and icing it and that he's fine to play. Well, then I think there's your answer. Clara's mouth dropped open in surprise. You aren't even going to examine him to be sure? Look, Clara, we do our job to the best of our abilities. We examine the athletes and give them our suggestions, but these are grown men. They're going to do what they think is best for themselves and for their careers. I appreciate your concern, but I have to ask one thing. Is there more, perhaps, to this concern? Maybe the fact that you knew him from high school? He lifted an eyebrow as he posed the question. Clara felt herself bristle. Was Justin asking out of curiosity's sake or for some other reason? I've known Mason for a long time, but my concern is for his health, nothing more. Justin stared at her a moment longer, as if gauging her sincerity before nodding. Well, you've done your duty then. I'll note your concerns about his injury, but unless something changes my mind during practice today, he'll be playing on Sunday. Very good, sir. Clara wasn't happy with the decision, but she had made her concerns known. All she could do now was continue to work with him and pray that God protected him.